you just keep grinding away, eventually it will come through.
I think it will definitely happen sort of in spite of what, is being done at a government level. So many people now in Australia know about medical cannabis. I mean, in 2014, when we started talking about it, you just didn't talk about it out loud. We spoke in code. We were worried about a knock on the door all the time. There's a much greater awareness now. And if you're in a public place and you start talking about cannabis now, it's like a magnet, and all these people start coming to you and telling you about, how they use it, or that their mum uses it, or someone that they love would like to try it. And I just think the barometer in this space really is the number of people that is still using it illicitly in Australia, where they don't actually know what they're using, but it's kind of fairly forgiving and they get relief anyway. So while ever they can afford to buy what's on the black market, if they can't afford the legal market, that's where they're going to stay. And I just think that's a shame. It can be so much better than that if people have access that's, supervised medically. They have a range of products that they can choose from. So it's really personalised medicine. They get what they particularly need as an individual, and, and it's at a price that they can afford. But the current situation in Australia is that there's huge awareness of it, but there's a huge black market for it. And I don't think that's a great place for patients to be. Some people are comfortable in that space, but, for many of the elderly, the frail, those that are really sick or have very complex conditions, I think they're much better suited to being under the care of a doctor and not worrying about the knock on the door that, that many of them still get. So.
Lucy and Teresa, I don't know. I haven't been formally introduced to you. I've had more discussion with Gail over the last 6 months than the two of you. I know of you within the industry, but I'm not formally introduced. So I guess what I'm doing here, I'm actually recording, so I hope I have your consent on that.
That's fine.
Yep.
And what I'm doing here is I just developed a podcast. I've been sending it to the industry here in Australia to just help to close that information gap as much as I can, and provide, I guess, industry insight and where the industry is going. So I guess I open it up to you two to kind of provide your background, and then I'll explain where I come from.
Okay. Well, do you want me to? I'll start. My background in the cannabis space really began in 2014. And that was when my youngest son was terminally ill. And we tried him on vaporized cannabis to try and manage his nausea and vomiting. And to our surprise, it worked so well when everything else had failed that we decided that we shouldn't be criminalised for trying to help him, and he shouldn't be criminalised for using what sort of worked for him. So we started to, I guess, lobby. Didn't realise at the time what a big fight we were getting into, but we just started to lobby, first locally with our local politicians, and then at a state level, and then at a federal level. And I formed United in Compassion just not long before Dan passed away, because I thought it was really important to educate. There was not a lot of awareness around the medical benefits of cannabis. There was a lot of fear and propaganda that was residual from the war on drugs. And I felt that the best thing that I could probably do was to try and help bring Australia a bit more into the current way of thinking, as we were seeing overseas. So much more was happening. And so I ran the first symposium in 2014. Dan passed away on the 5th of February 2015, and we had the legalisation come through on the first anniversary of his death in 2016. So I was involved at a political level in those early days. Some of that was good, some of that was bad. I'm not. I used to say I was proud of what we'd done, but I'm not proud of the system that Australia's adopted, and I guess that's led me to the point where I'm still involved and still trying to make things better for Australian patients. So that was kind of the background of why we formed the Australian Medicinal Cannabis Association. And you know, in the course of my work in the cannabis space, I met Teresa several years ago, and we kind of just quietly worked away together to try and improve the legislation that we have for Australian patients. And I think Teresa and I share a real common bond in that we both want to see a really patient-centric industry. And so we work well together towards that aim.
Wow, that's amazing. I've met so many people throughout the years affected positively by the plant. But to hear your story is very, very moving, and you could see why you're such an advocate for it.
Well, look, to me, I mean, I was just a mum, really. My background was in nursing, and my husband's background was in policing and actually in being in the drug squad. So for us, it really was a challenge to our own perceptions about the use of cannabis. But we very quickly got over that once we saw how much Dan benefited. It really gave him quality of life that he hadn't been enjoying. And really, you know, for me, the biggest regret was that we hadn't come across cannabis earlier in his cancer journey. After Dan passed away, I then found out my mum had advanced breast cancer. And when it got into her spine quite extensively, I sort of said to her, right, that's it, Mum, you're going on cannabis oil. And she very happily did. And she lived really well for the last 2 years of her life. Most of her friends didn't even know she was sick until a month before she passed away. So, and like yourself, I've met hundreds of people. You know, I've been involved in a couple of documentaries. I made a life of its own with Helen Kapelos back in 2014, and then High as Mike with DC Stories about 18 months ago. And in the course of making those, and in talking with the green market, I've just met so many people. And as an ex-nurse, I can see how many of my patients would benefit. And, you know, I want people to have a better life, basically. And that's what drives me. And, you know, I promised Dan, in the final days of his life that I would keep going until we had a system that we could both be proud of.
Oh, that's amazing. I've been just a proponent of natural products, steering away from the typical pharmaceutical model that we have presently, and just trying to enact just natural products for health and well-being, I think is where I lie. And so that's my passion behind it, because I think it should just be tax regulated, just like any other natural remedy.
I tend to agree with you, but that's not where I came from. And I was very much in favor of the pharmaceutical model. That was what I, as a nurse working sort of 20 years, that was how you're taught. That's what you do. But, I saw how all those modern, very expensive drugs failed Dan. Very early in his cancer journey, they told us, there's not any problems really that we can't manage now with pharmaceuticals. And that was so not the case. He tried everything. He got basically every side effect that every, product could give him. And the day he tried cannabis, if it hadn't have been so serious, it would have been funny, because, this was a kid who'd never smoked in his life. His father was teaching him how to draw back on a joint. And the colour just came straight back into his face, and he had an appetite, and he started to eat again. He didn't have to go to hospital every time he had chemotherapy. His life was just so much better in every way. And I remember him telling me, I feel like I've got some control back. And he'd been through it all. He'd been addicted to benzos and opiates, and he'd gone cold turkey to try and get off those. And so I get what people say now when they have an addiction to those drugs and the demons that they battle in trying to free themselves from that addiction. And it just makes complete sense to me that cannabis is just a far safer alternative. The toxicity levels are so low. It's reasonably safe, and I just want people to feel that they can easily go to their doctor and have a conversation about it, not feel that they're doing something wrong, and be comforted by a knowledgeable doctor who's willing to prescribe, and for them to be able to access that product without having to break the bank. That's all I want.
Yeah, it's very hard, I think, just to change that stereotype, but I think through consistent education on all levels, just being persistent through that, sooner or later it will break through. Especially, I think Australia has a little bit more of a way to, they have a long way to go compared to some other regions, but I think if you just keep grinding away, eventually it will come through.
I think it will definitely happen sort of in spite of what, is being done at a government level. So many people now in Australia know about medical cannabis. I mean, in 2014, when we started talking about it, you just didn't talk about it out loud. We spoke in code. We were worried about a knock on the door all the time. There's a much greater awareness now. And if you're in a public place and you start talking about cannabis now, it's like a magnet, and all these people start coming to you and telling you about, how they use it, or that their mum uses it, or someone that they love would like to try it. And I just think the barometer in this space really is the number of people that is still using it illicitly in Australia, where they don't actually know what they're using, but it's kind of fairly forgiving and they get relief anyway. So whatever they can afford to buy what's on the black market, if they can't afford the legal market, that's where they're going to stay. And I just think that's a shame. It can be so much better than that if people have access that's, supervised medically. They have a range of products that they can choose from. So it's really personalized medicine. They get what they particularly need as an individual, and it's at a price that they can afford. But the current situation in Australia is that there's huge awareness of it, but there's a huge black market for it. And I don't think that's a great place for patients to be. Some people are comfortable in that space, but, for many of the elderly, the frail, those that are really sick or have very complex conditions, I think they're much better suited to being under the care of a doctor and not worrying about the knock on the door that, that many of them still get. So.
Well, you want that, especially in that situation where it's definitely a medical condition and a complex medical condition. You're going to want consistency of that product, and you're going to want regulation behind that product. And so anybody that's in that situation is going to want that oversight with the product that they're being given, and it shouldn't have to come to them going to the black market to go source that.
Yeah, exactly. So that's about me. That's where I'm at.
And Teresa, and your background and place in this industry?
So I've been in the pharmaceutical industry for a long time, 24 years, I have to admit. And I originally started off in the prescription medicines industry. After finishing my PhD, I moved into the medical and regulatory space and spent quite a lot of years in those roles, right up to senior management roles in that area, and always around the regulation of medicines. And then I did a law degree in between that, with the intention of specialising still in predominantly the pharmaceutical or therapeutic goods space. And my involvement in medicinal cannabis started in 2014 when there was just some discussion around legalisation back then. And I became particularly interested in it when I read a study that had been conducted in the Illawarra region involving CBD in mice, and these mice had Alzheimer's disease, and they did a placebo-controlled trial, and they were able to demonstrate that the CBD group had their Alzheimer's reversed. And to me, that was of particular interest because my mother has Alzheimer's disease, and so I started to look at cannabis from a scientific perspective out of interest, but also from a regulatory perspective, given that the discussions at the time were around legalisation. And so I started to, I guess, through a series of events, become an expert in the area through my own research, and then just becoming involved at a very early stage. And in 2015, my father died of metastatic prostate cancer, and it had metastasized through his spine and through his legs, and he was in excruciating pain before he died. They had him dosed up as far as they could dose him on methadone and morphine, but they couldn't dose him up enough without killing him. And he was still in excruciating pain. And at that point in time, it wasn't legalised, and I couldn't go to the black market to get him some medicinal cannabis to help him, mainly because of the risk to my legal practice. And I just watched him die in excruciating pain, and it was just the most awful thing to see. And so that's part of my personal advocacy towards medicinal cannabis, because I have seen, particularly over the last 6 years, the benefits it has had to patients in chronic pain and also many other conditions. In the early days of legalisation and pre-legalisation, my focus was mostly on advising companies who wanted to become involved in the space. So it was very sort of commercially oriented advice. But when I started to see so many patient cases where they couldn't get access and were resorting to the black market, I just became more and more concerned about the regulatory system. And that's how I approached Lucy at one of her UIC symposiums. I reached out to her and said, Lucy, I want to help some of these patients that can't get access. I want to offer my legal services pro bono, and I want to see if I can help these people. And through the years, Lucy and I have forged a partnership, and we have both been advocates for just trying to improve the system more than it is now. And in the context of AMCA, I was initially on the board of MCC, but I just had some concerns about how that organisation was running, and so I stepped off that role, and Lucy and I talked about setting up AMCA, and so that's how AMCA came to be born.
I think it's very interesting, your past of being a qualified scientist and then also a lawyer and having interaction in this field, because those are two very in this industry, those are two very specific subjects that you have a background in and can provide a lot of value add within this industry. And I think having that background is I haven't seen anybody with those types of qualifications in my past that is centered around that, at least here in Australia.
Yeah, look, and look, you've hit the nail on the head, because my doing law was very strategic for that very reason, because while I was in the industry, the regulatory space is quasi-legal anyway, but many times we would engage lawyers on legal matters, and it was quite frustrating that they just didn't understand the science and didn't understand the commerciality. And so you'd end up getting legal advice that was not commercially focused or that misunderstood the science. And you'd often spend a lot of time and legal fees on actually bringing the lawyers up to speed with both the science and the commercial imperatives before you could even get legal advice. So for me, it was precisely about the value add. That's actually why I did law, because then I knew that I could bring that skill set that I had from the pharmaceutical industry into my legal practice.
Well, I think it's very, there's also taking that knowledge and now trying to portray this, which is where you guys are headed with this organization, I'm assuming, is portraying all that knowledge over to the legislators and trying to get the legislation passed and put through that has both of those sides to it. So I find that very interesting that you're now playing a role with that that organization to help regulate. Yeah,
it's funny, because I when people ask me what you do, I say I'm a lawyer because I have now my role is as a partner in a law firm. But the clients I have, I've become more of a trusted advisor simply because the advice is not just legal advice. It's scientific advice. It's regulatory advice. It's commercial advice. It's strategic advice. And, when you've been in the industry that long and you've spent the time to train, the things that I see in the industry as the problems with the regulatory system, a lot of people wouldn't be able to see because they haven't got that background.
Of course. And so I guess the how I came in contact with you, with your organization, was through Gail. And Gail was the first person that I really found in the industry that really went out to the market, went out and talked to all players that are interested in this industry, everybody from companies to ancillary businesses, and she really started to get to know who is who and where everybody is positioned. And I hadn't seen anybody like Gail to date. And I think she's a vital asset because she really wants to get to know everybody through the industry and connect and push the industry forward from all angles. And so that's where I just wanted to get Gail's background and experience and just tell where you came from and what you're doing.
But before Gail steps in, I just want to say that Gail, I have known Gail for many years because Gail used to work for a company that was one of my clients, and it was a long-standing client, and we recruited Gail as the senior marketing executive of that company. And in the years that I worked with that company, and Gail was actually my client, she was extraordinary. Her capability as an executive, as a senior marketing and sales professional were beyond what I have ever seen before. And she commits 1,000% to anything she does. And Lucy and I have seen that in spades since we started working with her. First, I started working with her when I convinced her to come over to MCC when I was on that board. So I recruited her to come onto MCC, and Lucy and I are very fortunate that she agreed to join us in establishing AMCA as well. And so we couldn't have a better executive working for us than Gail.
I saw others kind of in that position, trying to represent MCC and push the industry to the next level. But I just don't think anybody was really fit. When I saw Gail and was introduced to her, and when we had a sit down, I could tell that Gail was a different animal, and that could actually make a difference and push this thing to the next level here in Australia. So yeah, I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
But I wanted to just get Gail, just Gail's take on where you've come from, Gail, and where you're headed, where you are now, and where you're headed.
Thank you. You're all very kind and generous. Thank you very much. So I came into this industry after 30 years in Big Pharma, at the invitation, as she said, of Teresa. She's a very convincing person. I had no history or knowledge at all of the industry, and really did it for Teresa because I believe she's so committed to this cause. And I very quickly found the industry to be well populated with people like yourself, Joshua, Lucy. As I met people like you, I got to know more about the industry because there was such a generosity to educate me, but also that commitment that I like to give, I found in spades from people like you. And I think this area just needs it so badly because the danger is that the government is seeing this industry as just a spin-off or a sideline of pharma. And from my 20 years experience in Australia, it is not. It is so different from the way that cannabis is perceived. You can't treat it as a man-made drug, which just has one type of molecule and that is it. That's very easy for the regulators, and as importantly for me, the reimbursement body. So if the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee has to manage not only the nature of cannabis in its many forms, but also the hundreds, if not thousands, of different formulations that are available, it's an impossible job. And I can see that there has to be a different answer for medicinal cannabis. It does not fit into the pharmaceutical space like a key in a lock because it is different. There are different indications, there are different formulations. And for me, a very big future issue, if not now, certainly over the coming months and years, is going to be how can we make it more affordable to patients? As well as that, I do think that we need in the short term to absolutely make sure that the price comes down for patients. So as Lucy said, they're not forced into the black market just to be able to afford a life-saving or a life-changing product. But I've really been impressed in the field. There are definitely people who are not on my wavelength, but it has been meeting people like yourselves, the three of you, that have made me want to remain engaged with it. It would have been very easy to walk away after the MCC experience, but to be honest, I think AMCA for me is the absolute essence of what at least the three, if not four of us on this call are trying to do in this industry, you know, with total heart involved. You know, it's more than just heads, it's about getting your heart involved. And then you have the passion to really see through what we need to see through in this industry.
So I guess the conversation originally started with MCC. So I guess between the three of you, can you tell me when MCC started, what the focus of it was, where it was and where it was heading until you guys currently formed what you're currently doing, and then maybe why you are focused on what you're doing now.
It might be good for Lucy to chip in there, as you did on a previous call we had, Lucy, where you talk about where you were before even Teresa joined MCC. I've
got to try and be diplomatic here, I guess. like obviously there was a need for an industry association, for a whole new industry, and that's not very often that happens. You know, boom, there's a new industry, and we could see that there were lots of people clambering to get into the space. But I used to go to all the Office of Drug Control update meetings, and I used to kind of be really a bit despondent about, you know, when I looked around the room, I would see lots of sharp suits and pointy shoes and lots of people talking about when can we export, and, you know, how many billions of dollars they were going to make. And I just used to think, oh my goodness, nobody's talking about what patients are going to be able to get it, who's going to prescribe it, what's it going to cost, you know. And it kind of continued in that way for a while. And when the legislation was passed, there was no regulations written at the time that it passed. So we had to wait for those regulations to come, to evolve. And I can remember when they did evolve, just thinking, oh my God, this is never going to work. So I think from the offset, we were on the back foot. And I think the industry is growing in spite of what the government's doing. I think without putting too much of a negative spin on it, the way it was set up, it was almost designed to fail. And I think when I realized that, I got that horrible sinking feeling like, oh my God, this is going to take a lot of work to set this right. And I think that's why people like Teresa and I sort of jumped in with both feet. We had nothing financial to gain from this. This was just about doing what was right. For me, it was about fulfilling Dan's legacy. And so I was very critical of the regulations, and, you know, and I still am now, because I can still see that there are so many patients that are failing, that are being failed by the system. So, you know, the industry's evolved. You know, it was very clunky and very top heavy in like very overburdened with regulation and a lot of cost, and all of that's kind of impacted the people that are still left standing now. And I think I look around any room and I can I see people that I want to align with, and I see people that I definitely don't want to align with. And it's been a process to find those people who really, I think, have the same goal for Australian patients and the industry at large. I mean, I definitely want a strong, robust, healthy industry, because, you know, the benefit of that down the track is a better range of products and more affordability for patients. So, you know, it's important that we have a strong focus on getting a strong industry, but kind of not at the expense of patients. And I guess I have seen some groups along the way who really wouldn't even know what a patient was, to be quite honest, you know, who don't sort of think that through. I've had industry people say, oh gosh, Lucy, we don't have to lobby government because you do that for us. You know, it's like we can just sit back and reap the financial rewards, and you can do all the hard slog. And for many times I've felt that, you know, I have been a little bit alone in that. I know that industry have been in a precarious position where they don't want to upset government when they're waiting on licenses or permits. And I get that. I can understand that. But I do think, you know, there are people within the industry who do want a strong industry so patients can benefit. And they're the people I want to work with. So I guess getting back to your question, I could see that wasn't happening. And, you know, when Teresa asked me to, you know, step up with her and to sort of form an association that we could work towards those common goals, I like Gail, Teresa's very persuasive. I couldn't say no, because that's what I wanted. And, you know, a few years ago, as part of this journey, when the regulations were coming out and we saw the way that patients had to access through the special access scheme, it was so unfriendly to patients. You know, back in, I think it was 2018, we formed the Australian Medicinal Cannabis Alliance, which was really, I kind of rang around and said, look, is anybody as disgusted in these regulations and this access pathway as I am? And I was kind of overwhelmed with people that wanted to come and sit down in a room together and talk out what we could do about it. And part of the exercise, I got printed out the access pathway onto a poster. and it was 2 meters long. I had to stand on the table and hold it up as high as I could for people to see the flow chart of what an Australian patient had to do with their doctor to get access to medicinal cannabis. I mean, it was hideous. But a lot of the people that were in that room have now come along to be part of AMCA. And to be quite honest, they're the people that I want to work with. They're people who understand that you have to criticise in able to get something better. If we just sit back and accept things as they are, we're probably going to see an Australian industry which is based on exports around the globe, and without so much as a second thought to Australian patients. And I don't want that, because I'm an Australian, I live in Australia, I want to be able to access it in my aging years. I want, other members of my family to have the benefits of it. So I think if we can get AMCA to really focus on what's best for Australian patients, doesn't mean that that's at the expense of industry, because we want a great, strong industry. But there's lots of things that need addressing. Things like the driving issue in Australia. There's no test for impairment with, it's just the detection of THC means, automatic loss of license. Things like that don't sit well with me. And whilst it doesn't make you popular with the politicians to challenge those kind of issues, I just think that they're very necessary and we have to do it.
Oh, most definitely. There needs to be a voice from everyone to test the politicians and communicate with the politicians on what they're trying to implement. But I think it starts to get a little bit fractured. So I got to see firsthand the transition from a medical market in Washington State to a recreational market. And you kind of saw that money, as you were saying, get involved and then push towards this recreational taxed system. And the medical patients kind of started to get overlooked. And so you do lose sight of this at times in this industry, because everybody's focused on creating that money and those tax dollars and everything behind it. So it's definitely something that needs to be checked and balanced. But those issues, like the driving issues, definitely need to be addressed. And I think there's certain startups that are trying to address those issues and help solve them. That's a very tough one, because I think they don't have the capability to test that in a real-time format as of yet, like a breathalyzer you would with alcohol or something like that. I know certain organizations are trying to solve that issue.
Yeah, but I think in the meantime, there can be some common sense and some perspective applied. A medical patient who isn't impaired should be allowed, I believe, to have some sort of pass to be able to drive. We see things like negative impacts on recruitment for clinical trials because of the driving issue. We see young people living rural and remote, or any age, who can't get to their medical appointments because their choice is, do I drive or do I have my medicine? It's unreasonable, I think, and it's not comparative to other drugs, So I just think there just needs to be some common sense applied until we get things like real-time tests for impairment, which, to be quite honest, that might never happen. But
Joshua, one of the main points with the situation with the driving laws at the moment is that there is no reason why the laws should not have been changed to allow patients who are on medicinal cannabis by prescription to be exempt from offences, because we have that exemption in our New South Wales legislation, for example, for morphine. And morphine is also a drug which can cause impairment. And no one suggests that the mere detection of morphine is an offence if you're under a prescription, because they've put in a carve-out to that situation where a patient is on a medical prescription for morphine. So what is the difference between permitting a patient on morphine to be able to drive, but then not permitting a patient who's on medicinal cannabis to be able to drive?
It's a great question. I mean, morphine's, from my understanding, I think I've had morphine once when I broke my collarbone, but that's a very strong opiate drug.
It is, and it's a sedating drug, and it does cause impairment to some degree, although patients will develop tolerance. And you don't know when a patient is impaired, but the product information for all of those products, opioids, benzodiazepines, and medicinal cannabis, include information around the possibility of impairment. And in the consumer medicines information, which is what the patient gets when they're dispensed the product, it actually says, do not drive or operate machinery if you're feeling impaired or whilst you're taking it. Now, it's up to the patient in those cases to decide whether they're feeling impaired and should not drive or operate machinery. So in the New South Wales legislation, because there is that carve out, then it's left to the patient to decide. But it won't be an offence if they're driving and morphine is detected in their system. So why, for God's sakes, do we not have the same provision for THC?
I think that's a very good question that needs to be presented. I guess I'm going to take it back to MCC. That's one of the issues that you guys, I'm assuming, hope to solve with AMCA. I saw, me personally, having worked over in the US, I saw a lot of different organizations pop up over there, and it was very, there wasn't a unified voice to the industry. And it was a very similar situation to here, where there's kind of 4 or 5 different organizations that came about early on. And finally, they came to the conclusion over there, this is just in Washington State, but they came to the conclusion that there needed to be a unified voice. So they all combined and they came up with what's called the Cannabis Alliance. And they have a lot of interaction with the legislators over there. They have a lot of interaction with the actual industry. And there's just open communication and monthly meetings that are held in downtown Seattle that help drive the industry forward. And so that's why I've tried to open up discussions with organizations like yours to see where you're headed, what you're doing. And so that's why I asked the question about MCC and now AMCA, and there's a few other ones, the IHA, and I'm just trying to get an idea of an overview of what you're doing and where you're headed.
I might chime in there if that's all right, Joshua, just in trying to answer, why does such a young industry have three industry associations effectively at this early stage? And I think, the first one to set up was MCC. And I was originally interested in that, but I just felt like they didn't really have much direction at the beginning, and I was kind of a bit too busy to be involved, so I fell away. Then MCIA started up, and to be quite honest, I thought, this is crazy. Why do we have 2? Why can't they just get together? And Teresa, by that stage, had become involved with MCC, and so I encouraged her, and she accompanied me to Canberra to have a discussion with MCIA about the idea of the 2 organisations becoming one. And it became quite clear very quickly that they had very different goals, or very different means of achieving those goals. And so it just didn't happen. And I guess, it would have been probably more fortunate had MCC continued on and sort of grown up, I guess, in a sense, with people like Gail and Teresa at the, you know, on the board and at the helm, but it just didn't happen. So the unfortunate consequence of that is that now there are 3, and I think we all understand that that's probably not the most desirable place to be, but the people that are at AMCA now are really, I think, many of the pioneers who have been working in this space anyway since the beginning. So, other groups have come and they're doing their thing. We're the ones that, I believe have really been inserted into the space and, kind of working away often behind the scenes to try and break down some of the barriers to patient access and help the industry indirectly in that sense. So while we're new, we're kind of the old guys anyway. So if that helps you put it into perspective.
That is a good perspective, because I knew the MCC when it came on, and I knew there was a few. I know Teresa was there, and you were there, and there's some others that were somewhat running it, but it wasn't until Gail came along that actually reached out and really got to know these different. It felt like there just really wasn't anybody guiding it, and there was periods of kind of no communication coming from MCC, and I haven't really even heard from the MCIA at all, or have any communication with them. But I think that organization whatever that organization is, whether it's you or whoever it is, really needs to get out there and understand all the different aspects to the industry, to be able to present a solid case or communication with the legislators.
And that's exactly what Gail did. The day she walked into MCC, she was one of the first things Gail said to me is, the first thing I'm going to do is contact every single one of the members and have a discussion about them, get their views on how MCC is going and what they want.
Yes.
And I mean, I had only been on MCC, I think it was over 12 months, but about 15 months. And they asked me to join because they wanted a legal member on the board. But it was, I was very concerned about governance from the outset, and governance was a concern when I stepped onto the board. The decision-making process concerned me, and I honestly got to a point where I thought, no, this organisation, the way it runs is not where I want to be. The focus is wrong, the expertise isn't there, and I thought it was better to walk away and set up a new association than to try and fix the endemic problem in MCC. And in fact, look, to be honest, when I stepped away, I was so exhausted from the experience that I just didn't know if I had it in me to set up a new association. And I thank Lucy for actually giving me the crutches to overcome that, and look where we are today. I'm very glad she did that, because what we have now is precisely the association that this industry needed from the outset.
Yeah, I was contacted just recently by that merger that's happened with MCC and MCIA, and they asked me to pay a fee or whatever. But I was thinking to myself, you don't even really know what I do or how I'm involved in the industry or my past or anything like that. And I was just, you came out and just asked me for money, but you don't really have my interest at heart. And that's where I found that Gail is that kind of missing link there that can really try to understand everybody and bring that, that collaboration within the industry.
And Joshua, we're very adamant that we want all aspects of the industry because, you know, it has to go forward as a whole. You know, we don't want to leave anybody behind. So we need representation from industry, from advocacy, from research, from education, from doctors and prescribers, from nurses. You know, it has to all move forward together. And I think really MCIA, really the focus is industry and licensed authorities within industry. And, you know, and I was disappointed that they didn't have a broader view, but that was their view. And that's probably, you know, that's why, you know, there were two. And the fact that, you know, now there are three, it's because we want something different to the others. We want, you know, we just don't want to leave anybody behind, you know, because ultimately it's the patient that's left behind. If any one part of this industry fails or doesn't proceed, you know, at the rate that it should, and we might not always probably take the most, we don't always give applause to the government or take, you know, congratulations messages to the government. But that's because, you know, there are things that still need to be done. There are problems that need to be fixed. And, you know, to be honest, you know, the reason that we had an inquiry into the barriers of patient access was because people like Teresa and I went to Canberra and basically demanded it. And, you know, our government didn't even want an inquiry. They don't want to know what the problems are. So whenever we have a problem at that level, you know, we're kind of in a holding pattern, but they can't see that. So, you know, I think for us, the biggest challenge is going to be to deliver some negative messages in a positive way. And, you know, I feel like I've always been negative Nancy, and we're always complaining things are not good enough, you know, and I can just kind of hear the health minister in the background saying, but what more do you want? We've legalised it for you. Well, we want people to actually be able to get it and to afford it and to not be traumatised by the process. And I really don't think that that's too much to ask. In Australia, you know, in this day and age, we should be able to access good quality medicine at an affordable price. And it should be about what works for the individual patient instead of the kind of blanket pharmaceutical approach, which has failed so many people and is why we have such demand for cannabis in the first place.
Just a couple questions there. As far as hasn't the price of product, I know on the wholesale level it's been driven down because you are starting to be able to import that product from abroad, correct?
Correct, yeah.
So it seems like the price, I know the price of the wholesale level has been driven down. So I'm assuming the price on the retail level is more cost effective these days.
Yeah, but there's a major problem here, Joshua, because the imported product doesn't need to meet the same standards as domestic product. And so the only prerequisite is that the incoming product complies with the standards in the country of origin. And that may not necessarily be to good manufacturing practice and good agricultural practice standards. And so there's a question mark around imported product and whether it is good enough or matches the standards of the domestic product. And that has two issues. There are two issues raised by that. One, do patients who are prescribed a product that has been sourced overseas, do they actually receive the highest quality product possible? And I think the answer to that question is no. So it's not just a question of driving the price down, it's also ensuring that patients get a high quality product. And the second issue is this, that we are proliferating the imported product at the expense of getting our domestic industry up and running and actually putting the resources into increasing the staff at the Office of Drug Control so that licenses can be processed much more quickly than 2 years, and actually enabling a lot of our domestic companies that have spent millions of dollars establishing facilities only to have to sit in the queue for a couple of years to get their licenses.
Very much agree with the regulators coming in and policing it and helping to push either those licensing through or push the industry forward. And the only time I saw that in the US is when tax dollars were generated by the product. And then the regulators could come in now and they have the backing of money to employ people to get that off the ground. It wasn't until tax dollars really came in to support the industry that you had that support from those regulators.
Yeah.
Look,
I
know if
remember, sorry,
yeah, go ahead.
I remember saying quite early on in the piece that if it takes some taxes to enable the industry, then let's do it. Because if that's what's standing in the way of the government opening the doors, then maybe, I think what we want, if our end goal is patient access and we need to impose a tax on cannabis, then let's do it. Ultimately, what will drive the price down is volume, and we don't have that here. We have a fledgling industry that can't get off the ground because the government's not enabling it.
I think if you have a tax on it, yes, initially it might drive the price up, but it's very temporary. It will help push the industry forward, and then it will scale that up very quickly because it will be in the government's interest to push that along. As far as the certifications with GACP and GMP practices, I think any product that is distributed in Australia should meet those standards. I don't think you should be importing non-regulated product from abroad. You don't know what you're bringing in, and then you're just beating out the prices of domestic GMP product that has a very high quality standard, and then you're driving out the industry here. So these guys that have put in millions of dollars, these publicly listed company and private, just don't have anywhere to go with their product. They're looking to markets abroad to sell it.
Yeah, and the reason the TGA has said publicly that they allow overseas products to have those different standards is because they want to ensure that patients have access. Now that frustrates the hell out of me, excuse my language, because with respect, the basis upon which you can ensure that patients get access is to enable the domestic industry.
No, I very much
and that's
agree.
what we've been asking from the outset.
And I think it would take those guys would get up and running faster if it was domestically sourced. I think everybody would create a local industry a lot quicker if that came about.
Which can only have economic benefits.
Definitely. So those were some of the issues. Is there driving, the standardization, possible taxation that was just mentioned? What other issues are you guys looking to solve? I saw on the website, it was just a few things, but what else are you guys looking to tackle given your current circumstance?
So I guess
you also raised in your email the rescheduling. Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah. No, you go ahead, Teresa.
The issue of rescheduling is a live issue at the moment because there is a private submission that has been put in, and also there's the delegate's own submission for the downscheduling of low-dose CBD from S4 to S3. Are you aware of that issue, Joshua?
Yes, I'm very much on top of that. I've heard, but for people that don't know, if you want to recap that, that would be great.
So at the moment, the submission is proposing that pure CBD, i.e. CBD that has purity of greater than or equal to 98%, and the other 2% is naturally derived impurities, opposed to impurities that are added. The proposal is to allow low-dose CBD to be an over-the-counter medicine. And the problem is that the predominant use of any cannabis is not CBD alone, it's whole plant cannabis. And, the CBD-rich cannabis products still have other cannabinoids and terpenes and flavonoids in them. And so there is very limited utility for pure CBD in the first place. Even if the submission is ultimately approved by the scheduling delegate, what you still have is an unapproved product. And so you can still only access that product on a patient-by-patient basis. And so I don't think it's going to make any difference. My view of the matter is that it's a means by which the government wants to show the public that it is progressing in the cannabis field, but in reality, it's not going to make much difference at all.
And so I guess if it's not going to make much difference in that descheduling, is there another issue that you would push or try to push forward?
Oh, look, it's a difficult situation because our scheduling framework is based on safety. And so the framework, how it's operated historically, is that any new substance that's introduced into Australia is always scheduled as a Schedule 4 medicine to start with, if it's a new chemical entity, or if it has narcotic or psychotropic properties, it would start as a S8. But to say that medicinal cannabis was a new substance is a bit of a fallacy, because, as we all know, it's been around for centuries. It is appropriate, in my view, to be cautious with a product or a substance that has psychotropic or narcotic properties, like a THC-rich product. And so I firmly believe that a product containing high levels of THC should be either S8 or S4. That's my firm view, and I won't resolve from that. However, a product that is low THC and is CBD rich, that's a different story. There's enough safety data in the literature that would suggest that whole plant CBD is safe. At least it's safe enough that it shouldn't be a Schedule 4 medicine. The difficulty we have to overcome, however, is that we have to satisfy this threshold of providing sufficient safety information around whole plant CBD-rich products to justify its down scheduling. And unfortunately, because we now have all CBD products as Schedule 8, how it usually works is that you go from Schedule 8 to Schedule 4, then you submit another application and you go from Schedule 4 to Schedule 3, then you submit another application and you go from Schedule 3 to Schedule 2, and then you submit another application and you go out of the schedule altogether. And that is a progressive process over time and experience with the product and no safety concerns with the product. And so by putting CBD whole plant products into Schedule 8, the government has created this very difficult regulatory burden and hurdle that we will need to overcome. And I don't really have the answers for you because our regulatory system is what it is, and it's not a grey area. It's a black and white area where what is the safety database for whole plant CBD products, and the problem we also have with medicinal cannabis is that there are so many chemovars, which means that one oil is not the same as another oil, and its composition is not the same. So how do we characterise what is essentially a herbal product derived from plants, and how do we group all of that together and make an assessment of all of those products as a whole?
I've been talking to a few organizations that are starting to conduct clinical trials. Will that help with that database to gather that information and help solve that problem?
Yes and no. You still have the problem. What are they conducting the clinical trials on? It will be a particular, it'll either be pure CBD or it will be a particular oil that is derived from a particular chemovar. Is that chemovar and that oil representative of all CBD-rich cannabis?
Gotcha. Copy that.
And so, look, this is probably what I see as one of the biggest, if not the biggest, hurdle to overcome.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, no, I can imagine, especially here in Australia, they love, you guys love rules, regulations, checks and balances, which can be a great thing, but it can be a very difficult thing in a market.
Joshua. I don't love it.
I guess one of the last things I wanted to talk about was trying to brand an Australian product to create export opportunities. I know you guys your goal is to create this flourishing domestic market, which I think is definitely a need. And I think the proposals that you guys have said in this discussion could help solve a lot of that. But then opening the Australian market up to exports, which it's currently already kind of already doing. They're already known for having very good standards and things like that. But bringing those standards behind a branding behind product that is a domestic, is that something that you guys are interested in?
Yes. So, well, in my practice area, one of my core areas of my practice is intellectual property and around branding. Is your question around?
I guess like Australian made.
Clean and green.
Clean and green, going abroad. I think those other markets that, like the US, once it opens up a little bit more, like China, Germany, obviously, they're going to want to know, just like your opiate market, they know that product is regulated, it's coming from a viable source, it's GMP, things like that. Is that something that interests your organization, or it's not really on the map yet, and maybe down the line?
No, it is. Yes, definitely. It's an interest. It's not just an interest of the organisation. It's a selling point for all of our members and my clients, and that's the whole focus. The origins from Australia are a big selling point.
Yeah, I think there'll be an overall kind of a broad dilemma there, though, on how we deliver what's going to be a sought after product, because we do have that clean, green, and very high regulatory kind of model. The problem is going to be when we're not competitive on a pricing market, and that's because the costs here to produce domestically seem to be very high. So I think that's something that industry is going to have to be tackling and looking at from the get-go. And that's part of the reason why people like Teresa and I have sort of said we chose the wrong model. We should have really, I believe, still nobody's ever persuaded me otherwise, we should have had an independent regulator where we didn't have to set the bar. Well, we could set it high, but it could be a flexible bar. So I think the model that we chose in Australia through the TGA is setting the bar so high, and already from the get-go, these companies have massive regulatory burden and therefore financial burden. So it's going to be difficult for them to compete on a global market.
I think it's their main problem at the moment. And I'm seeing it firsthand, is that they just cannot produce it at a price. Same product, GMP, GACP, EU GMP product that they can source overseas in other countries, other continents such as Africa, South America, and it's the same product. They can produce it a lot cheaper than you can here, and I think they're having a problem with that domestic model at the moment. I think they're running into a big problem.
Yeah, and to be quite honest, Joshua, I think that writing was on the wall right from the beginning. But some industry were averse to criticising the model. Whereas people like us who it didn't actually, it didn't have that same implications from a financial point of view for me to be critical of it. But a lot of industry didn't criticise when I think that they probably should have been, because now they've got what they've got. A lot would argue that there's no going back, but I still think, if you've got a broken model, you should actually take the time to go back and fix what's broken instead of just trying to make it do, because I don't think it's ever going to do.
So Lucy, do you think that, how do you go about trying to fix that model? What's the format? How do you engage industry? How do you engage the legislators? What's the process from here?
Well, look, I'm not quite sure what that's going to look like now. Originally we had the original model was the independent regulator bill, which was a cross-party bill, which sort of set the whole thing in motion, and that's where the politicking came into it, and that was sort of tipped out at the 11th hour, and the government put in its own amendment of the Narcotic Drugs Act. And so, we went from what was going to be, we thought, a very flexible model, which recognised that cannabis was not like other pharmaceuticals and that it needed its own regulators so that it could be a bit more flexible and could try and we still always wanted a good product. We don't want to compromise on quality, but the bar was set so high with things like, security and, the facility demands, for indoor growing, that put a lot of cost up front before, and I think some of these companies are bleeding. They've spent billions in setting up their facilities and getting their licenses, but they still not had anything sort of marketable, and they're still waiting for payday. And that's where we're at now. And, some of the industry, and I think probably MCIA were very, where Teresa and I and people like us would argue that we've got the wrong model, we need an independent regulator, they would say, no, we don't want to change now, we're too far down track, well, this is what we've got. Are they happy with it? I wouldn't be if I was a cannabis producer.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I haven't even thought of having, at this point in time, trying to change that overall model. I think that would take quite a bit of doing. I guess if a whole new proposition was, outlaid to them with taxation and different things like that, then maybe you could go about it. I know they're trying to move to the single license model within the ODC, which is slightly different from what it's currently operating, but pretty much on a similar pathway. It's not a big, huge jump or anything.
Yeah, and certainly there were some, there were things that they could have done, to make things a lot more simple, but that never happened. And maybe we are too far down the track, but we have lots of hidden costs, which all ultimately impacts on the patient, because they're the ones that have to pay the full cost, because it's effectively in a regulatory limbo. It's an approved, unapproved medicine. It's not able to be listed on the ARTG. It's not going to be subsidised on the PBS. Where does this end? I'm just not, I've got more questions than answers. But
Of course. I guess there is kind of this overlap in the industry with the hemp side of things, where the two, they cross paths a little bit. Is that anything that you guys are focused on?
Yeah.
I guess, sorry, Therese, you're going to chip in?
No, you go ahead. You go ahead first.
I was going to say, look, I met James Vosper very early, and I've been dealing with him very openly and very collaboratively and constructively ever since. I think we are very, very clear that we are representing medicinal cannabis, whereas his organisation that you mentioned earlier, is more across the hemp industry. And so we work very smoothly in a collaborative fashion. We keep the communication open. We don't see each other as competitors at all. In fact, we try and refer different people to each other to make sure that they're dealing with the association that is most appropriate to them.
It's good to know. That's good to know.
Yeah.
And Gail, anything out, like based upon the topics that we covered, did you want to add anything to the discussion that we had covered so far?
I would. Thank you very much for that, Joshua. There is an area that I would particularly like to raise, which is to do with stigma and education. And this is an area that I think our organisation can make a significant addition to this field. As you know, there's a lot of stigma amongst the population, amongst especially doctors, and to a much lesser extent, the rest of the healthcare professional field. I know I can see from our website that the bulk of our events at the moment are with Lucy and some of the clinicians she's been dealing with to provide very, very independent and well-founded education for healthcare practitioners, not just doctors, but nurses and anyone else who really wants to get that very independent educational training. There are certainly other educators as well, and I think they provide a very good service. What I'm hoping with AMCA is that not only will we be able to be a conduit to such education, and you might be interested to know that our first 5 sign-ups, 3 of which were on the day that we launched, were from nurses and doctors. And what we truly believe is what we have on our website is that our strength is in our breadth. And I think where no association has gone to date is that big enough interaction with doctors, nurses, midwives, and the community. And that's, I think, where we are very different. If you have a look at our board members, that's on the our board page of our website, you'll see doctors, researchers, a representative of the nurses and midwives, and Lucy representing the patients. And I think this is an area that has been untapped, or certainly just the surface has been scratched to date. And I think the system we have, you said, are we too far down to change it? I personally think no, because I think when you look at the enormous number, the growth in the number of prescriptions that are reported on a monthly or quarterly basis, it's going up quite rapidly now. the SAS system was not designed for this. Patients are still having to pay through the nose. Yes, the wholesale price may have gone down, but we were talking to an organization last week that was legitimately complaining that, in fact, they may have reduced the prices to the clinics, for example, or the retailers, but they are then just making a bigger profit, and the patients are still in many cases paying the same price. So the pricing has to change. I think one of the ways that that can change is not only with us trying to work with the regulators and with the government to implement better systems, lowering the cost of production. I spoke to a cultivator last week who just said, is it worth me going into this? And what a difficult question is that for me to answer. I spoke to an affiliate organization who was saying, thank God you're around, because, I've just been spending an hour on the line to one of our customers who has been waiting more than 2 years for their license. They still don't have it. So I think without pressure from doctors and nurses and researchers to help us in this cause, we're just not going to get where we need to be as quickly as we need to be for patients. And I think we need to engage with the RACGP, we need to engage with the AMA. We are already engaging with the pharmacy guild. So I think it's really, really important that we stick with our belief that it is through our breadth that we are stronger, and that we can tackle many of the issues and many of the much of the stigma that very, very important players in this field still have. And when they're on board, when they are less hesitant to help their patients and pass them off to a clinic, and there's nothing wrong with the clinics that have doctors that know what they're doing. But if you're an older patient like my parents, who trust their GP more than they even do their family, they won't go to a clinic because they only want to deal with their own GP. And the problem is their own GP may not be a believer in cannabis. So we've got, for me, a much broader field of issues than just the government or just the regulators or just the industry. We've got this whole breadth of this field that we need to tackle. And the way we plan to tackle that is by committees headed up by people who really know what they're doing, who can really get to the crunch of what it is in the different areas that need tackling in the priority in which they need to be tackled. And I think the board that we have at the moment with AMCA has that breadth to be leading and driving those committees that will be manned or womaned by members who are totally engaged and believe in what they're doing. And then you divide and conquer the problems.
I think the one thing that I think you can capitalize on is open communication with the industry, some type of formalized plan of how and what you are working towards. To just inform everybody that's involved on what you're doing. I don't think it's overly complicated. I just don't think the industry is properly. They're getting drips and drabs from everywhere. But if you presented it in an organized fashion that came out, whatever it is, monthly or weekly, whatever it is. And also gathered communication in a timely, organized manner, I think you could take it a long way, because I'm not seeing that currently. I started to get that a little bit with you, with MCC. You saw an open communication. It was very easy to reach out to you, and then you saw stuff come through when you were informed of it. And so I think continuing that and coming up with some type of organization behind that, where you can start to see, what's going on, what you're working towards. These are the issues, just stuff like that, I think can go a long way here in Australia.
Yeah, I think that's very good advice, Joshua. And it's this kind of feedback that can help really direct, as you say, our next steps. we're not pushy people, but it's very important to communicate what it is we're trying to do.
So as far as your website, where can you be reached, and how can you get a hold of you guys?
Well, hopefully it's fairly easy. We've got both a contact us page and a join us page. So if people want to contact me just to find out a bit more about the organisation, they can just fill in the form there and online, get through to our email, and I connect back with people immediately. The Join Us page is really for people who've had a good look through the website, or who've had a chat with myself or Lucy or some of Teresa or other board members, and they decide they do want to sign up, which many have been doing. If there are other ways that you think we can be more obvious beyond what you've already suggested to make it easier for people to engage with us, then we'd certainly be very happy to hear your perspective on that.
And Lucy and Teresa, do you have anything else that you wanted to add, I guess, before we head off?
No, Joshua, just, I think this is a real opportunity. I think we're all joined really, we have a common goal, and I think that's going to help us to work really well together. For us, I think it's kind of a matter of deciding where the priorities lie, and perhaps, after we've done our initial membership sort of drive, so we have enough people there to reach out to, probably one of the first things we'll be doing is doing a survey to see what people, are seeing as priority areas. And then, once we have that on board, we can start to tackle those one at a time. I always think it's a bit like eating an elephant. This isn't, this is a long game. This is not going to be something that's easily fixed overnight. It's one mouthful at a time, one problem at a time. And, it is the long game. So at least now we're organised, and we've got the right people on board to sort of start to meet some of those challenges together.
And Teresa? She might have dropped off.
I think.
No, I'm here. I'm here.
I was just asking. I was just asking if you wanted to add any last-minute thoughts.
Yes. Just to say that I setting up AMCA and having the board directors accept a role on the board, and all of those board directors being pioneers, having had Gail agree to come and join us as well, I'm now excited about the possibilities as a group, what we can do, and the momentum that's gathering with AMCA launching, and with the people that are contacting Gail to become members. It's all self-motivating. I actually feel like now we're on the right journey, and the possibility of setting up these committees, and the actual interest that we've got from the industry community about joining these committees. I know we're on the right track now. It's taken us a few years to get here, and we've learned a lot along the way. But Lucy, Gail, and I, we just energised every time we interact, because we've got purpose now. We've got the right structure. We've got governance. We've got an enviable board of directors, and so I think we'll get there.
I think you guys will get there too, and I think you can make strides. Like I said, on just open communication, and I think you guys are on the right path. And full disclosure, I'm actually asking some of the other organizations to be on my podcast, not to persuade one or the other, just to get the information to understand where everybody's headed, and how they're approaching the industry and what their focus is.
Of course.
Josh, Joshua, we haven't heard from you, and if Lucy and Teresa do have a few minutes, I just think it would be really interesting for them to hear what you do, little bit of background about your interests in your marketplace, for example, and your podcasts.
So I started out in the I-502 industry in Washington State. I was given an opportunity back in 2014 to start. It was a startup organization called PayQuick. It solves the banking issue that you run into the United States. And so it's a banking compliance platform, essentially. And they partner with banks and do the compliance on these bank accounts that are over there. And so I got to see firsthand kind of this transition from a medical market in Washington State to recreational. Saw new grow facilities and a new industry really come to light. And I've always been a proponent of like I said, natural products, of regulating this industry and taxation. And so I ended up working over there for a few years, and then I was recruited by a large international ag company over here in Australia, and then dealt with Office of Drug Control, site plans, floor plans, security measures, all that kind of stuff. And then I broke off with a biochemist named Craig Davis, and we together offer two different things to the industry. One's my marketplace, so it's a compliance platform that ensures that everybody that's on it can trade with one another, and it kind of screens everybody that's on there to ensure they're licensed and they meet the GMP certifications or whatever they're claiming that they can supply. And then on the other end, Craig deals with the extraction of natural products. So it's not necessarily specific to cannabis. We deal with all different things from hops to sandalwood oil and all different oil extracts, but very much natural products focused. And we do extraction of CO2 and hydrocarbon on those products. And so we both share that passion for natural products and have been pushing those extractions throughout Australia. And so that's our focus to make money. The podcast, I think, is there to help inform the industry, help push it forward in some way, and try to collaborate and just understand where everybody's coming from the domestic. It's kind of Australia, New Zealand industry, and see where everything's headed.
It's interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned banking. We just one of our biggest challenges in getting set up is actually been opening a bank account. We were knocked back by a bank who decided after 6 weeks that we were too high a risk, but wouldn't elaborate on what high risk meant. But I suspect it's got something to do with the fact that we had cannabis in our name. And I've not come across that before in Australia. I didn't think that was an issue here, but perhaps it is one that we need to keep an eye on.
Yeah, the banks, they have their own regulation and their own regulators, and so they will want to see compliance on that end, and ensure that they are all they're caring about, that there's no money laundering coming through and it's not coming from unverified sources and things like that. So if they don't know exactly what you're doing, then they might have some concerns depending on the geographic region that you're in.
Yeah, it was interesting though, but they didn't even actually really ask, you know. So we basically wanted a basic account to bank membership fees, full stop, you know. But anyway, it's
probably just take them too much time to do the paperwork and the proper. And that's what we ended up running into in the U.S. Same thing is that the banks didn't have the time or energy to set up the proper regulation behind it. So we came in and did the regulation for them essentially, and we had licensing of our own. So yeah, it's a pain in the butt for the banks as well.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah,
But,
thank
I
you,
wanna
Joshua.
thank you all for coming on. I really appreciate it, taking the time out of your Monday afternoon. And no, thank you for informing us on what you guys are doing and where you're headed.
Really
Thanks a
good
lot.
talking to you. Thank you very much.
Always a pleasure.
Thank
If
you.
you've got any other questions, don't hesitate to contact us.
I will, most definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye
Bye.
now.
Bye
Right.
now.